Welcome to the podcast from the Huffines Institute for Sports Medicine and Human Performance. I'm your host, Tim Lightfoot, and I want to thank you for joining us this week. We strive every week to have an interesting person from the world of sports medicine, human performance, health, sport management, and a variety of other areas, and I think you'll find that this week is no exception. We also want to welcome you back to the studio. As many of you know, we have transitioned to video podcasts. We still have all of our 249 audio podcasts out there on the website. But certainly, if you still like the audio ones, these will be in audio only as well. So, tune in and find out what we've got. But let me tell you a little bit about, or welcome our guests this week. We have Ms. Kristi, it should be Dr. Kristi Dosh with us. Welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome. We'll tell them a little bit about you, and then we'll get started about this. Kristi has a bachelor's degree in politics from Oglethorpe University, and then she went to the University of Florida and got a doctoral degree in jurisprudence, so she's an attorney. She transitioned from being an attorney to working in the general area of sports business. She's the founder of businessofcollegesports.com, founder of Guide My Brand. She has written a couple books. Both of which we'll talk about today. Saturday, Millionaires, How Winning Football Builds Winning Colleges, Balancing Baseball, How Collective Bargaining Has Changed the Major Leagues. She currently writes for Forbes and Entrepreneur magazines. She's here actually with our division of sport management, giving a big talk today, and we really appreciate you coming by before the talk. We appreciate Dr. Hudson and Dylan for bringing you by. And so again, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I always love being in College Station. So I've been coming annually for, I think this is 8 straight years now. I've been here at least once a year. So I don't want to break my streak.
Welcome back. That's right. Here in Aggieland, we're all about traditions.
Yes.
And so if you do something twice, it's a tradition. So.
I think that's why I like it here so much. I'm a very big tradition person. I'd never thought about that before. That's probably why I identify here.
Yeah. So we always start off with kind of figuring out or talking about how you got to where you are. You went and you became an attorney, and now you're in sport business. Now, I can certainly see some of the connections, but why did you make that jump?
It's interesting because I went to law school thinking it would be great if I got a job in sports, being an attorney, but I didn't have to. And I have students ask me all the time if they should go to law school because they want to be an agent or they want to work for a team. And I always say, okay, if something happened and you did not get a job in sports, would you want to practice law? And if the answer is no, then don't go to law school. For me, I always had sort of a backup plan. If I didn't get a job in sports, I really was interested in corporate law. I had grown up around it. One of my parents works a lot with corporate attorneys. And so I knew I was also interested in that. And that is what I ended up doing. I did not get a job in sports coming out of law school. And so I thought I was done. I was going to go work on commercial mortgage-backed securities. Unfortunately, those tanked the market a few months after I started practicing law. And I had written this legal journal article my last year of law school about collective bargaining in Major League Baseball. I had been really interested in reading the collective bargaining agreement, and I had gone back to look at historically all the collective bargaining agreements that came before it, and had really started asking questions about, well, why did this provision end up in there? And, who argued for this? Was it the league or was it the players? And why does this exist? And I just found that super interesting. And I started blogging about business in baseball, collective bargaining, and a number of other things. 100% for fun. I never thought it was going to change my career, but as the market continued to tank and I had less and less work to do at the law firm where I worked, I started writing more and more and more, and it led to some amazing opportunities over the course of a couple of years. I always tell this story to students and they're like, I'm going to start a blog. I'm like, okay, I didn't write like 2 blogs and it happened. Right. I mean, I wrote consistently for 2 years before it really did anything for me. And then I started getting invited to write on sort of bigger and better blogs.
There are no overnight sensations, right?
No, not at all. And I was lucky enough to get asked to come write for Forbes about collective bargaining in all the major pro leagues. And having the law degree allowed me the ability to be able to read the collective bargaining agreements and understand what they said at some level. Right. And so I came on board at Forbes just to write write about collective bargaining. And over time, they gave me more leeway to write about whatever I wanted. And that ended up leading into writing about the finances of college athletics, which is actually what brought me to College Station the first time. I came here the first time for the first home game of the 2011 season. They had just announced they were leaving the Big 12, had not announced they were going to the SEC, but everybody knew that's what was going to happen. So it was a really neat time to be here in College Station. I went to Florida for law school, so I'm sort of an SEC person. My husband went to Auburn. He's an SEC guy, and he almost exclusively wrote about SEC football at the time. So it was really neat to come here and see how excited people were to move to the SEC because, I think we took it for granted. We both went to SEC schools. Yeah. So to see another fan base get so excited to become part of that was really neat. And
I went to school in Tennessee, so I understand exactly. Yeah, that there was that excitement. And it's interesting coincidence that our first SEC game was against Florida.
I know, which I came back for that game because I got sent. By that time, what sort of happened to me was I was here in August. At about the same time, I was interviewing at ESPN. I ended up getting that job, and I went to work for ESPN in October of 2011, and that's when I left practicing law. I had been still practicing law full-time while writing for Forbes for 2 years. I did TV at Comcast Sports Southeast. I was doing radio interviews, all for free, all on the side, on top of working like 60 to 70 hour weeks as an attorney. And it really was like a passion project. It totally was for fun. I never imagined I was going to get a full-time job offer to go be a sports business reporter, but that's what happened.
And with ESPN.
With ESPN, no less.
I think you were the first female business reporter for ESPN,
yes.
right?
And really only the second sports business reporter they've ever had. They had Darren Ravel. He had left. Then I came in. Then he came back after I left. And that was such an interesting opportunity. And people think it was such an easy decision to make. ESPN makes you a job offer. Of course you go work at ESPN. Right. But at that point, I was almost a 5-year attorney. I was, hopefully on track to become a partner. I made really good money. I had a client base I really liked. And as much as it was an easy decision in the sense that I don't think I ever seriously considered turning it down, it was a little nerve-wracking because I went to, I'd gone to law school because I wanted to be an attorney, and I had law school loans still.
Sure.
And, I was very much on this partner track. And I thought, what if I go do this? ESPN's offering me a 2-year contract. What if they don't re-sign me at the end of the contract? Then what am I doing with my life? I can come back to practicing law, but I'm not going to come back in at the same place I'm leaving, and I will have already given up my clients.
There's really difficulty in what you know versus what you don't know.
Right.
The devil you know versus the devil you don't know. Making that decision to jump off that cliff,
And what happened is they didn't renew me at the end of my 2-year contract. So my, while I was at ESPN, I thankfully had the foresight to think, okay, what am I going to do next? I'm probably not going to go back to practicing law, but just because I think the lifestyle shift to go back to that would have been difficult. By then I had gotten another book deal. My book ended up coming out at about the same time I left ESPN in the fall of 2013. That book was on the business of college football. In fact, I did one of my book signings here in College Station, and it was the most successful book signing I had. And I have to thank the guys here at TexAgs. Actually, they were big promoters of me and my book when it was coming out, and were always really supportive. And I feel like they sort of got started around the same time I did. And I sort of watched them grow, and I think I got in early on as like a guest and got in early with the guys and got to know them well. And so Texas A&M became a really special place for me to come back. And when I came back for my book signing, I was just so taken aback by the support I had in this community. And this, I went to Florida. Florida's on the cover of my book. I did a book signing there, and it was actually the worst book signing I had on my tour.
Really? Wow. Well, let's talk about that first book a little bit. Saturday Millionaires, How Winning Football Builds Winning Colleges. And as I reviewed the book, it really resonated with a theme that we have had people talk about, and that is the importance of college athletics to universities.
Right.
So many people think that pulls money away from academics, and that there's often it's a zero-sum game. You either give it to athletics or you give it to academics, and if one wins, the other loses. But that's not what really your book talks about, is it?
No, and actually that was my favorite chapter of the book, is the final chapter of the book, which is about this intersection of athletics and academics. And in fact, now I do consulting studies where I get pulled in for, let's say a school's considering moving conferences, or they're considering adding football, or they want to move football up a level. I get brought in on those sorts of studies by consulting groups. And the piece of the study I always do is, what would this change in athletics mean to the university at large. I am fascinated by that subject. I think people don't realize that impact. You know, people have probably heard there's a quote out there about how athletics is the front porch of the university.
Sure, yeah.
There's far more media coverage of athletics. And you don't have to be winning national titles in football or basketball for that to happen. In fact, I read one study that's in my book, and I think it followed, I can't remember if it was Louisville or Western Kentucky. It was one of the two. I think it was Western Kentucky. And it followed the number of times they were mentioned in major news media for athletics versus the number of times they were mentioned for academics. It's not even close. Athletics gets far more media coverage and can really help you reach particularly out-of-state students, which for public universities is a lot of money when you can get those out-of-state students to want to come attend to your university.
Yeah, recently I heard a report that admissions or people applying for admission at Texas Tech, because they just had such a big presence in the Final Four basketball tournament, have gone through the roof.
Yeah.
We saw that when Johnny Manziel was here.
Right.
All of a sudden, we got all that attention athletically, and the applications to come here just went out of sight.
And it happens at every single school. If you make it, I'd say, to the Sweet 16 or beyond, you really see an impact. And then for college football, it's making it to the semifinals or to one of the Access Bowls, one of the bigger bowl games that used to be, making it into the BCS games. And I remember I had moved to Florida. I'm not from Florida. I'm from Atlanta, but I had moved to Florida the year, I think, before Florida Gulf Coast had their first run. I had never heard of Florida Gulf Coast. I lived in the state and I had never heard of the university. But then they made it in the basketball tournament and they've been tracking it ever since. And they've got some great stats on how applications went up, particularly from out-of-state students, how apparel sales went up. A lot of schools are then able to parlay that into a better licensing deal where they're making more money on their apparel. So there are all these great effects that it has on donations, on applications. Boise State, I remember, this just popped in my head when I was writing my book and I was talking to Boise State about the impact, because I started writing the book before the college football playoff existed. I knew it was coming, so it's in the book, but we were still under the BCS and Boise State had just kind of had their run of success. And I talked to them about the impact it had and they said, a really interesting thing that happened to us? We got better faculty members. They said we actually had faculty members who told us during their interviews that the reason they became more aware of Boise State and sort of looked into the job opening was because they were more aware of Boise State through football.
Sure.
And I think that's so fascinating.
Well, and we've been talking primarily, and people think about the big name schools, the A&Ms, the Boise State, so forth. But this is a real struggle in smaller universities funding athletics. I know, for example, some of the historically black universities in Louisiana in particular, like Southern in particular, has had huge budget shortfalls over the years. And there are people that are questioning why they still have athletics, because they still have a couple $1 million athletic budget. And people say, couldn't we use that wiser in the academic side? What would you say to that?
I don't know that you can.
Yeah.
So I run my own PR agency now, so I'm really familiar with like media value and looking at how much it costs to advertise. And I think that at that level, instead of looking at athletics and saying, why isn't athletics making money or why do we have this? Athletics is a marketing expense for the university, essentially. That's even how I would categorize it. If it were me and it were my business, I would put that under my marketing budget because that is a way to market the university. And it's a cheaper way to market the university than if you were going to go out and buy advertising.
Yeah.
And I think it's more effective most of the time.
I was at University of North Carolina, Charlotte for many years, and they didn't have a football team for many years. Right. And the discussion always on campus was, wow, it'll cost us $12 million. That was the number I remember. And we don't have that money, but people kept coming back to it will help us build a sense of community. And they'd had very successful soccer programs, made the Final Four in the soccer tournament and so forth. That still didn't give them the community that football did. Which is interesting. So that's another aspect of the athletics is the community building side of things.
I remember somebody, and I can't remember if this is in my book, but I've used it in some of my consulting studies, and I wish I could attribute the right person to this quote, but they called the effect football chicken soup. And they talked about how schools that have football generally have better freshman retention rates because football is a way for people to integrate into the community. And part of it's the time of year football falls. Sure. It's right as you're coming into a university. And so these studies have found that football can help integrate people as a freshman into the community. They make more friends. They feel more like they're part of something. They're less likely to then leave because that can be a tough transition transition for some kids. They've never really been away from home or spent a lot of time away from their parents or been, out of state or, lived in a different city. And, not that it happens for everybody, obviously, but I remember I worked on the report for UAB after they cut football.
Right.
I was part of the second consulting group that came in and reevaluated everything. We did not tell them to bring football back, but they did end up bringing football back after our study. And that was one of the things we included in there was some information on how football helps freshman retention rates.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And they did really well. Since
Yes,
they brought it back.
and since they brought it back, I mean, perfect storm. They've had such success on the field that now it looks like a really smart decision.
Yeah. I mean, we played them recently, and they were tough game. Let's talk about your more recent book. You've brought your love of collective bargaining in baseball back to the book front. And so recently, I think 2017, you published Balancing Baseball, How Collective Bargaining Has Changed the Major Leagues. How has collective bargaining changed the major leagues?
One thing that's interesting about that book is I got that book deal first. I got that book deal, I want to say 2009, and had started writing that book and was maybe 75% of the way through it. And baseball had a new collective bargaining agreement come out early. Like they were, I think at that point, I can't remember, but I think a couple of years away from needing a new one. And out of nowhere, they had this new labor agreement. And I was like, oh, well, now we can't publish the book and not have the new collective bargaining agreement in there. So then I had to go back and work on it. And some things were kind of changing in baseball, and we decided to hold the book and kind of wait for things to settle down. Well, then in the interim, I got my book deal for my college football book and ended up moving on to work on that book, and then didn't come back to the baseball book till later. So it's funny because it was my first book deal, but it'll end up being my second published book, and it's actually still not out yet. That book has been a 10-year labor of love for me. But I really do find collective bargaining fascinating. I'm probably like one of the only people, but I see it. I think it'll end up mostly being used as a text. It's with an academic publisher, and I think it'll be more of an academic text than something a fan would pick up and read.
Sure.
But it's interesting to see how the power has shifted in Major League Baseball over the years. They by far have the strongest players association. It's not even close. All the other, the football athletes and basketball, they all wish they were the Major League Baseball Players Association, because the power, I think, has really shifted where the players have more of the power than the owners in baseball a lot of times and can push through things in that collective bargaining agreement that we don't see happen in the other leagues. So I've always found baseball to be the most fascinating one to follow because the players started with no power, and over the course of 35, 40 years totally shifted that power dynamic.
It's an interesting question whether or not the other major leagues would allow that to happen.
Well, they probably learned from watching baseball, so now it won't. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of it's the leadership. I think baseball, it was the right timing. They had the right leaders at the right time, and they had players who were willing to kind of put it all out on the line, and it was just sort of the perfect storm. But you're right. I don't know that it'll ever be that way in the other leagues.
Yeah. We'll wrap up with I guess a discussion of kind of one of the things that you're noted for, and that's the personal branding side of things. What do you mean by personal branding, and how have you become successful at it?
So everyone has a personal brand, whether they know it or not. Essentially, your personal brand is just what other people think about you, what they think you are, what you stand for, what you do, what your passions are. There can be a lot packed into that. But I heard a speaker at a conference years ago say something that really stuck with me about personal branding. And she said, your personal brand is the third thing somebody says about you when they introduce you. And she said, start paying attention when you're at networking events with like your boss or whatever. They'll introduce you to someone, they'll say your name, and they'll probably say something related to your job title or your job function. What's the third thing they say about you?
What was the third thing I said about you?
I was not paying attention. I wish I had been. At the time, I was an attorney, and I thought about it, and it was, my name, and then that I was, an associate, and I focused on this practice area or whatever. The third thing was always about how much I loved sports, and that I blogged about sports, or that I had this book deal. As time went on, that third thing changed, but it was always about sports. And I actually had a guy one year at a CLE I was at that was a sports-related CLE. I sat next to him at lunch, and we were talking about what we were doing, and at the end, he said, if I run into you next year and you're still practicing law and you're not doing something in sports, I'm going to be really disappointed in you. And at the time I thought, what are you talking about? Like, I had no aspirations to work in sports anymore at that point. And it did take me a little over a year, but about a year and a half later was when I ended up at ESPN. So it's that third thing that people think about you. That's your brand. But the good news is you can change it. If you start paying attention to that third thing people say about you, you don't really like it, and it's not what maybe people say you're great at sales, and that is not what you want to be known for. You not want to be known for sales. You want to be known for this other thing. You can intentionally craft a personal brand. You can start creating content, whether that's blogging or it's social media. You can be speaking. You can join organizations. There's a lot of different ways that you can start to intentionally shift your personal brand. And when I work with my clients on it, I always tell them in the very beginning of our work together, I want you to choose 3 things you want to be known for professionally. Sure. And those 3 things, we're going to pretend they're buckets. And from now on, everything you do that's forward facing that other people can see, giving a speech, writing a blog, posting on Twitter, giving a presentation at work, whatever it is, everything you put out into the universe that's forward facing has to fit in one of those 3 buckets. Professionally, of course, personal is different, but because then people will start to know you for those 3 things. Like if you start targeting the things you want to be known for and all of your efforts are focused on that, people are going to start to know you for that. And that's how you start creating that very intentional brand. Excellent.
We always ask candidates for faculty positions, if we met your boss at a barbecue, what's one sentence they'd say about you?
Yeah.
And so that's another way to start thinking about what your personal brand is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As we wrap up here, we always ask our guests what the take-home message is. If people remember nothing else from this discussion, what do you want people to remember?
As much as I think some of the anecdotes about college football are interesting, I think something that everyone can kind of latch on to and work on is that you need to be open to opportunities professionally, because you never know. I would have never imagined ESPN would come and ask me to go work for them full time, or that now I would be a publicist and a journalist instead of an attorney. So you've got to be open to it and not have that tunnel vision, especially I'm very type A. So I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew exactly what it was going to look like, the exact steps I had to take to make partner.
All planned out. Yeah.
But when you get that tunnel vision, you maybe miss these amazing opportunities out there. So just be very open to the opportunities that are around you.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
We really enjoyed it. And I'd like to thank everyone that's watching and listening for being with us today. Regular listeners of our podcast and now of our video will know that this is the time when we have podcast question of the week. And so our podcast question of the week is from our producer, Blake Crawford. He says, according to Kristi in her book, what is one of the most effective marketing means? And of course, my message goes away. According to Kristi in her book, what is one of the most effective marketing means for a university? And so be the first person to email us the answer to that question at huffines@tamu.edu, and you'll win one of our nifty podcast T-shirts. Matter of fact, here's one of our T-shirts here, kind of crumpled up. We'll show it to the camera and see it on the back. It's even got a working QR code on it. And so be the first one to send that response to us, and we'll send you one of those T-shirts. Once again, thank you, Kristi, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So enjoyed it. And again, thank you all for being with us this week. Look forward to our next podcast. We have another interesting person in the world of sports medicine and human performance. And until then, we hope you stay active and healthy.